I also would see reconciliation both as a process and as an outcome. And in kind of more recently, I've been thinking more and more of it as a process rather than just the outcome. And I would provide a little bit more of a complex definition of reconciliation in terms of how I see it, because I think mostly about reconciliation in the context of collective violence, political violence, mass violence. So I think reconciliation is a change, is a transformation at multiple levels. First, at psychological level, is a change from animosity to more friendly and amicable kind of attitudes toward the other. It's a relational change. So from relations of mistrust to developing trusting relations, to developing cooperation and mutual acceptance as well. And then at the group level, I see it as a change within each group that is involved, right, in that particular conflict and is going through the process of reconciliation. I see it as a change in group identities. So typically what happens in conflicts that go over long periods of time is that the identities of groups are kind of defined in opposition with whoever is the other is, in ways that they deny, delegitimize, dehumanize, right, the other, and it becomes part of one's identity. So without having a transformation in the content of that group identity, to make space, right, for reconciliation, I think that's also an important piece. And lastly, I see also importance in transformation and changes at the structural level. And by that, I mean, we talk about power dynamics and changes in the power dynamics. And sometimes that involve, changes in economic or other, right, kind of status, political kind of power in ways that, if there were high asymmetries in which one dominant groups, oppressed another group, or had, advantages over another group, then we would think about, right, restructuring the society in a way that, would be more equitable, so that, both groups would have a shared vision for a future, so that they can kind of live together in mutual acceptance, not just tolerance, but, right, in mutual acceptance of each other.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I wonder if you can chat with each other about where you're seeing examples of any of these changes that we could look to as examples of at least partial success.
I think there are examples in many places. Of course, I cannot think the perfect example of reconciliation, because it's always a messy process. I would think of South Africa as, one kind of important example of, that actually laid kind of the ground even for the study of reconciliation. And of course, it has, even that case has, its issues, but, there are a lot of, processes about truth-telling and really reckoning with the past and providing that moral framework of understanding, right, the apartheid regime and political transformations that happened that I think, could be taken as examples. And, there are other examples from other places as well I kind of don't want to put specific cases, because each of them has also, right, there is no perfect process, I think, of reconciliation as we know it. So we need to really look at, different cases and think about, what worked well, and in some cases, and what didn't work as well. It's a messy process.
Messy, very good word. Miroslav?
Yeah, maybe simply a comment on the difficulty of identifying good examples. One then thinks always it's got to be a perfect. As soon as something hasn't gone quite right, it's problematic. And I would all kind of urge us to go away from this kind of mindset. Often I think even what I wouldn't consider quite yet reconciliation, but I find it really important, pacification is sometimes all that is possible. and it is very often very important. And the process then goes always in with difficulties, and I don't think we should be surprised that it does. We're talking now about group reconciliation between groups, or kind of political types of reconciliation where state is an agent. But even when one thinks about interpersonal reconciliation, think about siblings, think about partners. How reconciliations occur. Generally, they are they're never perfect. They are halfway done. They're movements forward and then 2 steps backward. There are complex kinds of things that need to be managed. And one may think, well, that's for that reason. Reconciliation is kind of this squishy thing, and we can kind of put it aside. And yet, I don't think so, right? I think it's very important for us to attend to those fragile relationships. And something of the beauty of our humanity is there when we can attend to the fragility, to the inadequacies of the relationship, and nonetheless find the meaning in them, find and help them to bring their own kinds of fruit. I don't want to be understood to mean that by all means one ought to reconcile. There are situations when reconciliation isn't possible. There are situations where pacification isn't possible. But at the same time, it would seem to me that something of our humanity is lost when we give up on another human being and on our relationship with another human being. We may find ourselves in a situation where we have to do that. But on the other hand, we may also find strength to start rebuilding from the ground that has been pretty devastated. And through that building, to realize who we are as human beings and what we are capable of in terms of life that is worthy of us as human beings. And so in that sense, I would want to, without putting it as a pressure or finger wagging or anything of that sort, offer an invitation for a journey that may end up being very deeply enriching.
And let me pick up on that word journey. What has been your journey? Can you tell us a bit about your story, your beliefs that have brought you to being as interested as you are in our subject tonight, reconciliation?
Yeah, my interest in reconciliation started during the war in former Yugoslavia. And my question there, as a person who was a Croatian, but who has lived most of his life in Serbia, when these two groups became deadly enemies, I find myself somewhere in between. And being a Croat and Croatia being violated, third of its territory occupied, population driven out, and so forth, I was oscillating between kind of rage at what was going on and a kind of sense that rage, though understandable, and the impulses to which it led me was not worthy of me. I couldn't quite live with myself in that kind of situation. And then Book Exclusion and Embrace was an attempt to deal with myself, to theologically manage myself. And in some ways, this is probably the only book that I've written simply, exclusively for myself. I had nobody in mind. I had myself in mind and my own inner struggle for reconciliation, which I embraced and yet which I experienced as incredibly difficult. Behind it, I'll say one more personal story. Behind it lies a story of forgiveness that is deeply rooted in our family. When I was 1 year old, my brother was 5, and he was killed by the negligence of a soldier. Both of my parents, independent of each other, said that they had a verse from the New Testament occurred to them. And that is, forgive as you have been forgiven in Christ. Now, you think that's a relatively facile thing. A Bible is quoted, okay, we forgive, right? And yet, when I talk to my mother about it, she would always say, this was the most difficult thing that I have ever done. Everything in me screams, he needs to pay. And yet I know that that's not the path that I should follow. And so this was this internal struggle in her own soul, which was reflected back in my own struggle about forgiveness. That led me to exploration of what makes it so difficult, what makes it so beautiful, why should we pursue it, in what situations we might not be able to, or even there might not be ethically, morally responsible to do so. But the story is fairly personal, as you see, and it's my own, need not necessarily be yours as well.
Thank you, Miroslav. Rezarta?
I was born and raised in Albania during the time that it was a communist regime, and maybe many of you know that it was one of the harshest dictatorial regimes in that bloc, and it was cut off from, all other countries, actually, from the rest of the world for many years. I was a child when, in the first decade. By the way, now that we're talking about secular and religion and, these different worldviews, maybe I'll point out also that Albania in 1967 declared itself as the first officially atheist country in the world. And it basically destroyed churches and mosques. The clergy was persecuted. Well, not just persecuted, they were either executed or imprisoned. And the believers were harshly punished. So they managed to really eliminate religion from public life and for most of the private life as well. So in the first decade or so of my life, if somebody had asked me about religion, I wouldn't have known what it is. I wouldn't have known even the names of major religions or even my family's religious heritage. And that's kind of ironic because my grandmother, who lived with us, was a very religious person. And, she still kind of practiced right in private and, did her prayers. But it would never be talked about because it was just too dangerous. So that's kind of, the context. And in the second decade of my life afterwards, it was a very, a lot of turmoil, in Albania and in the region. So there was a lot of social chaos, there was a civil unrest, and there were wars going on during, the breakup of Yugoslavia, including the Bosnian War, and afterwards, toward the end of the 90s, the Kosovo War. So it was all of these contexts that really led me to think about questions of conflict, violence, and why people behave as they do, in these environments. And afterwards, that's why I studied in Turkey, I studied conflict resolution. And only actually more recently, after that, I started thinking more and studying more reconciliation. And the reason for that is because the discipline, at least my discipline within psychology, social psychology, and even in the conflict resolution, I believe the study of reconciliation it's more recent and followed a lot of reconciliation practices as they were happening around the world. That's how I became interested and started exploring more, but more from an empirical, I started seeking the truth about, these issues, but taking a more empirical lens.
And you've done remarkable work in Africa that I could ask you 10 questions about, but I'll resist the temptation. We're about to come to a time where everyone is going to get a chance to talk with each other. And many of the conflicts that have shaped your lives and that we've been alluding to are very far away from this room and from our day-to-day lives. And I'm curious, what would you say to somebody who may in their own personal life have some reconciliation they're grappling with, finding impossible to deal with? What would you say to them?
Stay at it, as long as you think it's wise. You know, the New Testament is in some ways strange book, and one of the strangest things that is there is that forgiveness is both an obligation and is made possible by God. And it's both obligation and something that has to come out of one's heart. Similar thing is about faith as well. But that means that the pursuit of forgiveness needs to be in the space between command and making it possible for myself to do the command. And that space is not easy to define, and that's why I think it makes very little sense to kind of insist as a kind of moral demand of a person to forgive when they are not yet quite prepared, ready to forgive, because forgiveness makes only sense, in my understanding, when it happens from the heart. And that's why I think we talked earlier also about this. That's why I think that it's probably not as useful to think in terms of political forgiveness or even group forgiveness, except in kind of analogical terms. There are kind of vague analogs to what we understand as forgiveness that can happen between groups. But at any rate, to return back, I think there is forgiveness in some ways for me is the grace of the new beginnings. It's the grace of the possibility of a reset. And in that sense, it's a very hopeful kind of thing. But like any hope, if you have a completely determined understanding or image of what you hope for, you might find yourself disappointed. Hope is a strange thing. We hope, Apostle Paul says, now I'm starting to preach. Is that what you wanted me to?
Go for it.
This is, Apostle Paul says, we hope in what we do not see. And we think, of course, how would you hope in something that you see? If you see it, you've got it, right? You don't have to hope. But there may be another element of this not seeing. And Martin Luther put it that way, understood it that way, namely that we hope and we do not see even clearly in our mind what the solution or what the content of the fulfilled hope will look like. Which is to say, hope is a certain kind of darkness. Looking in the future positively, but not nailing it down to the image that you have of the future. And then suddenly, hope, when it's fulfilled, one recognizes it as fulfillment of hope. Here's an example. So I fall in love. And when I've fallen in love, I had certain vision of who that person might be. And yet, when I had fallen actually in love, if I compared the image that I had to what was before me, I would have said, it's not quite that, right? And I could have said that, right? Right? Or I could have said, which is what I did say, oh, so you are what I have been hoping for all along, right? Right? So in a sense, it's a surprise of the future that one is open for. And I think for forgiveness to be successful, it's this kind of hope into the unseen that is recognized as good is essential.
Thank you, Miroslav. Rezarta?
So what I would say to people in front of me about reconciliation, I'm going to rephrase kind of your question as trying to understand it. It seems like kind of more of a question. So is there some inherent value in reconciliation, right? I mentioned I'm a social scientist, right? And that doesn't provide us an answer to this question in terms of, should that be the goal and the aspiration? But I look at it from a functional perspective. So why is it important? And I do see value and significance in reconciliation. So I'm going to start with a collective, and then we can go to a more interpersonal. Because for societies, especially when they are living close together, even if you come up with peace agreements, right, you do conflict resolution, right, and address the main conflict issues, if those groups and societies have been in conflict for a while, there are probably wrongs that have been done, and reconciliation, that's where it comes in, that even if the agreements are made, the violence, the issues where the peace is not going to come just by a peace agreement. So reconciliation is absolutely necessary so that the violence will not re-erupt again. Right? It's a societal process to bring right people together. So I think it's absolutely necessary in those conditions. And I would say. At the interpersonal level, I mean, thinking about probably we all have, within families, people who don't talk to each other and have conflicts that they have completely, right, set themselves kind of apart. And it has, even those have quite negative, right, consequences in dynamics, and a variety of consequences personally. So I think I would say that, I would go to the obstacles. So I think it's an important process. And I would say that probably the most important obstacle to it is righteousness, kind of self-righteousness, maybe at the individual level, and at the collective level, also collective self-righteousness in some ways. And I would say we need, if we approach kind of each other, and groups approach each other in whatever context with more humility, there is actually a lot of opportunities for overcoming, whatever is keeping us apart.
And when you say whatever's keeping us apart and you speak of families, you bring to mind something that we're all kind of grappling with. It's not a violent conflict, but there is the polarization of the country right now. We all feel it. We were just alluding to it in the introduction. And Miroslav, you mentioned when we were just getting acquainted earlier today that you sense that there's some things that remind you here of what you knew leading up to back home. And the conflict back home. And so I'm curious, many of us have family we only see once a year, and we get into a political argument and it gets testy and we don't engage at all. Some of us have actually relocated zip codes just because we don't want to be with each other anymore. What do you think about that? What do you advise us to do and think about that?
Well, what struck me similar as I kind of took temperature, is that the word? No, I kind of, as I culturally felt where I was, which is not particularly scientific at all. It's how I felt in this country over the maybe last 6 to 8 years, increasingly, and what I felt when I was in former Yugoslavia as the country was sliding toward the conflict. And those are analogies, and they're distant analogies, but some of those analogies to me are really important. What I discovered in both places is an increasing lack of porousness of people for the perspective of the others, unwillingness to entertain it as a reasonable possibility. Even more, any defection from the group toward middle ground or toward seeing something positive on the other side was punished by ostracism, and therefore it tended not to happen. So that you had this solidification of really artificially created identities, and persons who I know personally, they feel within one group, but in tension with themselves, but needing to belong to a particular group. There's something straining at our very humanity in those kinds of situations. My hope is, and what I found, but I try to also practice, that we can find a way in which to honor every person. My favorite command almost in the whole of New Testament is a two-word command that is generally not seen as a command at all, but it does come up in 1 Peter, and it says, honor everyone. Honor absolutely everyone. Now that presumes the distinction between who they are and what they have done, because you can't honor everything when you honor everyone. But I think that kind of distinction is really fundamental for entire reconciliation process, and it's certainly fundamental in the situation in which we are, these self-enclosed, impenetrable identities that somehow needs to be opened up. There are spaces where openings are occurring. And I think what we need to do is nurture those kinds of spaces when we can honor one another, even if we profoundly disagree. One of the great challenges I think it is for us today, how do you find ways to live together and negotiate profound and intellectually and emotionally and morally unbridgeable differences? That is the big challenge of the present moment. That is the big challenge of pluralism more generally.
Rezarta?
Yeah, so I mean, the processes that you're mentioning are really typical of group identity formation and, this rigidity that is created during the escalation of a conflict. And it reminded me actually when you were explaining of a study like in the 50s of Muzaffer Sharif. It's a famous study in which he actually wanted to see whether he can create artificially these group identities, whether can create the situations. And he brought kids in a summer camp, I think in Maine, and then he put them, in different areas, kind of the camp. They didn't know each other. They built these group identities, have their labels, and then they brought them together. They kind of discovered that both of these camps were there. They brought them together, but he created the conditions that were kind of more competitive. For instance, competitive games, or they brought them to have dinner together, but called one of the groups to come a little bit half an hour earlier so that they could get the best food. And then by the end of the night, they started throwing food at each other, and they went to their tents, and there were these peacemakers coming from one tent going to the others to try to make peace, and they were of course kicked out, and when they came back they were also kicked out by their own group as being a traitor. So I think it seems like those, and then they wanted to see, okay, we can create in this way this condition of conflict, and it feels kind of similar to the whole kind of polarization in a way that has been going on. But they also could undo it by bringing the groups together both in cooperation and toward common goals.
They could undo it.
They could undo it, yeah. So they basically, created different types of games where the groups needed to cooperate, and they also, had common goals. For instance, they put them together in a bus, and then the bus got stuck in the mud. So then they had somehow to get unstuck. So one group couldn't push the bus, the other couldn't, but when they were working together, toward that common goal, they became best friends when they came back from the camp. So in a way, they also created created conditions. So I think it's, it's possible to create also the conditions in the other way. But I think, one issue with the kind of the polarization, which is, this politicization of the identities and a lot of misinformation. I think there is a lot of misinformation. And there is some research, very interesting research that examines the perceptions of, liberals, conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans about what they think about us. We call them meta-perceptions. They find these huge divisions in terms of what the other think about us and what we think about their positions on issues. And then they ask the same people, what is the position on these very issues? And their actual positions are much closer than what they think, each other's positions are, and also what they think that the other think about us are much worse than what actually the other think of us. So correcting, all of these meta-perceptions, correcting all these, problematic perceptions is, there is also some kind of intervention work can actually bring the groups together. And of course we have social media and a lot of other platforms that have exacerbated these kind of differences. So we need to think about how to counteract that. And also we need to, kind of promote this idea of really listening to each other, because I think Trevor was mentioned, this is a dialogue, not a debate. And I think that's important because in a debate, when we're listening to each other, I'm not really listening. I'm trying to find arguments against what the other is saying. But the dialogue is, more about you really understanding, trying to understand where you're coming from, what the point. I might not agree. So I think there are, I think we are losing that capacity of actually really listening without directly assuming negative intentions and without assuming the evilness, of the other. So I think we'll need to work on those issues as a society.
So here we are in one of the capitals of intellectual life, certainly in New York and maybe in the world, in the country. And it's not really a secret that most in this environment are pretty much of one political and intellectual stripe. And there's an organization called FIRE, which ranks the climate of free speech at different campuses, and Columbia rated second lowest in the country, and it was beaten out this year by Harvard. And I wonder what we can do to change not merely the climate, but if we're all of one monoculture in these institutions, how do we reconcile with those who we are in disagreement with intellectually and politically if we're in this bubble? Miroslav?
With some you can, with some you can't reconcile. But my sense would be, first and foremost, honor them as human beings. Treat them as, treat us as human. That's what I would. Let me put it from the perspective of what I might want. I might desire. I might desire to be treated with dignity, not talked down to as if I were morally inferior specimen of humanity. Occasionally to listen what I might want to say and listen to the end and listen sympathetically. And I think if that were the case, it would go really far for me. Hopefully that would be the case also on the other side as well. I mean, my experience is that we can have conversations about deep differences. I mean, one of the reasons why I teach the class at Yale, Life Worth Living, is also that it's a schooling in talking about differences that are often unerasable, unbridgeable. They're there to remain. So we take different visions of what the good life is, represented by various traditions. What are we responsible for? How life should go? How we should feel if life goes well for us? Discuss those issues, and there people disagree significantly. But discussion can be not just peaceful; it can be actually productive. And it is productive. Every person names themselves, who they are, where they come from. Everybody knows, and it's okay. And then we talk what we think about it, what we truthfully think. Now, I know this is an artificial space of a classroom, but it's also university as a whole is one large artificial space as well. So it would seem to me that it's possible to do that. It may be more difficult to do it on some of the hot button issues, and we have to think how to talk about these kinds of issues. But I think practice of healthy pluralism at academic institution, practice of healthy pluralism in more culture more broadly is what we have to learn. And if we do not, we will be in a permanent state of conflict. Because the consensus seems to be at least shaking. So that we need to build consensus, or if we don't build consensus, we at least have to build modes of living together in the absence of consensus itself.
So, good evening, and thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, make it closer.
Closer? Yeah. Okay, great. I just want to give a shout out. No, I'm just joking. So, excuse me, Terry Watson, the City University of New York. I want to thank you for your time and your conversation, and I really appreciate your thoughtful comments. And often, as noted, it was embedded in the gospel, in the Bible. And while your positionalities all come from nation states, especially in the U.S. at this crucial time, and this is not about the Middle East per se, but how can we speak about reconciliation from a racialized perspective, meaning in the United States, particularly with the left and right and the great divide, and the problem of the social construction of race and, of course, racism, how can we speak of reconciliation based on a document, this founding, document, this Bible, right, that was man-made, that has been used for peonage, to not just enslavement per se, but the history of racial and racism in America. How can we reconcile such fundamental departures from the very book that we know is good? We know you said it's not what God does for us is what. I'm sorry, it's not what we do for God, it's what God does for us. But when such a document has been used in such awful ways, how can we reconcile that? And you said the word porous, that was beautiful. I'm trying to be more porous, but when people want me dead and negate the lives of my children, it's hard to let that go. So can you help me?
Yeah, first to recognize that indeed Bible has been used for many forms of oppression, and one of the most egregious is the racial kind of oppression. I'm hoping, and where I read the Bible, that it was against the Bible itself. And there are many other instances in which the Holy Book functions as a kind of legitimation for the projects that are not there. I mean, very good example to me, even today, and now this would be a whole lecture, how a certain appeal to Jesus Christ over the century of violence to justify violence, and it continues even today, whereas ability to square that with the biblical text, I mean, you have to do acrobatics. I understand those acrobatics. I know we are talking about resurrected Christ. We're not talking about earthly Christ. Earthly Christ was then. This one is now. And suddenly you have this Christ in the name of which you can wage wars and so forth. So there are many examples of such misuse of Bible, and I sometimes feel I need to rescue this poor document from the hands of those who read it, and want to say that it is a humanly written book, and a book that is, I have imaged it always in, do you know the painting by Matthias Grunewald, crucifixion scene? Matthias Grunewald painted in 16th century, beginning of 16th century. He has to the side of the crucifixion scene John the Baptist, and he's kind of with his ascetic attire, and then pointing an emaciated finger to crucified Christ. And I think that's what Bible is. In a sense, Bible is, for me, in the image of that John the Baptist, and its function is to point to Christ. And then Christ becomes the criterion of the Bible. And then when I put it this way, then I see, okay, I've got to nurture the commitments to what is at the core of the Bible, and then I can use it, I can read it. This can be not my tool, but I can be its tool in order to pursue a kind of liberation of those who have been oppressed. And certainly when I talk about reconciliation, to me, it was really important not to speak of forgiveness outside of concern for justice. Truth and justice are fundamental to any form of reconciliation processes. And I'll add one more thing when it comes to this side of reconciliation business. It's also, the forgiveness and reconciliation have become so cheap, so that it's kind of a gesture that makes no impact upon life except upon emotions of people in immediate relationship, changes none of the lives. And that cannot be the case with genuine reconciliation. And you can see the best in that anything like restitution has become absent from the practice of forgiveness. Now, my belief is that one receives forgiveness in two ways. One is by recognizing that one has wronged the other person, and two, by trying to make up for the wrong that one has done. Only in the context of such concern for recognition, the truth about what has transpired, and the commitment to justice or readdressing what has, the injury that has occurred, can one speak in any plausible way, I think, about forgiveness. And in that sense, I think that, to me, is straight there from the biblical text. And I'm quite then hopeful that the case can be made, though I understand. I have friends who don't know what to do with the Bible. Actually, I'm corresponding with one, and he just leaves him cold when he reads it, has all this stuff that he has to put aside, and he can't get quite to it. He'd rather read great poetry than read this book that for him is kind of broken. On the other hand, I myself, I find in the Bible this immense, incredible treasure. I have to dig for it, but it's there.
Can I say something about?
Please.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I cannot talk about the Bible, but as we're talking about reconciliation as a process and as an outcome, I mean, I'm not, I'm a newcomer. It's not new. I've been in the US for 20 years. But in my view, there hasn't been a reconciliation process in the US about racial history and about race. I remember when part of my academic work is on narratives and denial of violence from perpetrator groups, and trying to understand that denial and how we can, change that. I remember when I came to the US and I was like, well, there are, issues here, right? There is slavery, there is the genocide of indigenous people, and so on and so forth. And, oh, no, we don't need to deal with the past because, we had the civil rights movement was kind of the response that I got. And of course, we know that that's not the case. So there hasn't been, I think, a reconciliation process. And what a reconciliation process would look like is, first of all, addressing, right, these narratives and finding the truth and actually educating, the kind of the population and the new generations about the truth. And when we think about the education in the U.S. about the history about history of slavery and history of civil rights movement as well, there are studies conducted years ago, maybe a decade ago, by Low Southern Poverty Center that basically show that the curriculum is kind of dismal. They give, grades of F to most states, not on how just students are doing, but what is being taught. And that's, that is also part of that reconciliation process, right? First, the truth finding, and addressing, right, the narratives of the past in a truthful way, and based on that, addressing issues of, what justice is, what are the implications, right, of that in the present, and then you can start thinking about how to share, right, a vision for the future. So we often discuss about reconciliation in, faraway places, but then forget about, here and now.
So my name is John Tatamanel. I'm on the far side here. I suppose my question is really about the prefix "re" in reconciliation, which in some way at least presupposes some primary context which was ruptured. And then now we need to return to something that was lost. Now, clearly, what was just said about the U.S. Absolutely negates that. There is no reconciliation here possible in that sense because there was no original conciliation because everything remains unaddressed. But I wonder if reconciliation talk, even in these situations, doesn't have a certain kind of punch, namely that there is a kind of primordial solidarity, that we are, I mean, this is what I was hearing partly in what Miroslav was saying, that we belong to each other, even if we're strained all the way down in our particular histories. We simply are human beings who share the same planet, theologically children of the same God. And it feels to me that among the things we need is a stronger account of that kind of primordial sense that we're, as King would say, caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. So maybe that ontological sense of reconciliation needs to be said, even when we know practically that our histories are really messy, to put it mildly.
Amen. It's well put. I think that's in many ways right. And so we put under reconciliation various categories. I have used this image, and people have objected to it. I've used the image of embrace. And the image of embrace does not necessarily presume some kind of fall from prior grace. It simply is a gesture of reaffirming ever anew that we in fact do belong together, though each of us is our own, has our own particularity, our own sense of who we are, identity, and ought not to be swallowed into some kind of inclusive mush, no, or whatever, something of that sort.
I mean, I'm maybe just responding to the re part, and I would agree completely that, with the going back, even with, I think even with groups or individuals who had, kind of conciliation, right, in the past, you cannot go back to the way it was, right? So you cannot, the word restore is, is a bit problematic because it's supposed that you're going back to how we were before. And I don't think that's the case. You have to create a new, right, to recreate a new kind of relation. I mean, even in, right, interpersonal conflict, in marital conflict, right, when there are kind of wrongs that are done to each other, through that kind of process, if you're going through a process of, therapy, you don't go back. You never go back to exactly how you were, but you have to create a new we. And I think that's the case also with collectives.
Getting back to the favorite book, the Bible, one of the most important verses I think in the Bible is speaking about Jesus Christ. This is while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, sinner in that term doesn't mean just somebody who does something bad. It means somebody that hates Jesus Christ and everything that he stands for, and that is opposed to everything that he is that he was professing on earth, not just his political enemies, but also his spiritual enemies as well. And I think if you translate that and you dial that down to where we are today, and I'd like to hear your comment on this, I think in order to be reconciled with somebody, we have to die a little bit. I think we have to give up something. We have to sacrifice something. We have to know that isn't going to hurt. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be just shaking hands and walking off. And to make that stick. And, with that, I'll let you guys opine on that thought.
Yeah, I do think that reconciliation, forgiveness can be costly. It's in particular costly for those who have been wronged. And can be costly for those, and ought to be costly, I should say, for those who have done the wronging, in a sense that they need to do the repair of the wrong. I mean, we've talked also, we had this conversation prior to this event, and we had this series of conversations that are now popping up as you're asking various questions as we were discussing. It seems to me that, so if we think about forgiveness as an essential element of reconciliation, now that's a burden on the person who has been wronged, because they not only suffer wrong, but they also bear a repair work for that that wrong. They, I think, such a person affirm their own moral standing as a victim. They affirm their own moral strength in doing that. But nonetheless, that's a very heavy work that they have to do. Sometimes the perpetrator has been perceived simply as someone who can walk away, who has been forgiven, and that's what I want to push against. Kind of against the notion of the cheap grace in traditional Christian terminology, and translated into our interhuman relations, really a cheap kind of forgiveness that does not attend to what has actually transpired. So costliness, yes, but hopefully also joy. I've actually written an article on forgiveness and joy. And it was hard to write it because it can be a very tough thing. But forgiveness has its own joys. I've experienced them. Many of us probably have as well, and we should not forget them.
Hi. So I had a question that kind of segues from this. I mean, I think a lot of what you were just talking about very beautifully was the involvement of two parties in reconciliation. But I'm wondering if it's possible if only one party is willing to come to the table for reconciliation to take place.
Can there be reconciliation if one doesn't show up?
I don't think so. I think it's it's a two-way street, and it's true. And it's an important question, because this was actually a question that I was thinking about when I think about reconciliation, about who wants to reconcile, right? Who wants reconciliation to happen? Is it both parties? Is it one party? Or is it a third party that wants the parties, right, and is trying to push them to reconciliation? Now, if they don't come, right, if they don't engage at all, I'm not sure, right? There might be resistance at some point, but, if they completely not engage, I'm not sure how that reconciliation can happen like in that way. But it's possible there might be because reconciliation is kind of a long process, right? It's possible it can be initiated by one party, absolutely. But at some point, right, the other party will need to engage in that process as well. But it definitely can be initiated by one party.
What is possible to apologize? What is possible is to try to make up for the wrong, even if it's not received. And it's not just possible, but it actually is my responsibility to do that. I am responsible to do that no matter what the other person does, because that's between me, and if you believe in God and God, that's between me and my own conscience. It is also possible to forgive without the other person accepting that forgiveness. And it has its own meaning and sense, although it's a kind of incomplete thing. I think of forgiveness as somebody gives something to somebody else. Okay, so when somebody forgives, then gives a gift to somebody else. But it's possible. It hasn't happened to me, but I can imagine it happening. I buy a gift, I pack it, I spend quite a bit of money for my gift. I send it to my sister. She receives it. I know she has received it, and it's sitting on her table, and she will not open it. She thinks, what's this brother of mine trying to do? What is he trying to buy with this so-called gift? And she sits with this and she says, I don't trust this. Have I given her a gift? I have, but I kind of haven't. To give a gift means to somebody to receive a gift as well, right? Reception is element of it. There is value in me having given that gift if it was honest gift. But that gift is begging to be opened. So the gift of forgiveness wants to be received, and it's in a sense incomplete. And it takes actually two from both sides to work and for reconciliation to happen. But elements of it can be valuable, important, even apart from it.
Right, we have about 4 more minutes left, so this might need to be our last question.
Thank you for this beautiful experience. I think this is probably an appropriate segue from what you just said. So I actually have a departure of thought from the idea that forgiveness can only exist when someone receives it. And I say that embodying intersectional identities that have been collectively and systemically oppressed since before I was born. And as a consequence of the spiritual fortification that I received not only from my elders, who then went on to become my ancestors, and then in my home, and then within myself, I also want to address and allow it to take up space the idea of battle fatigue that then becomes forgiveness fatigue. I can tell you as a Black woman, I forgive and must forgive without the expectation of the acknowledgement of the gift of forgiveness to survive. If I waited for the acceptance of my gift of forgiveness, I would surely have perished long ago. And many of us are perishing from high blood pressure, from heart disease, because the expectation to be resilient in the battle is to also be persistent in the act of forgiveness without recognition or acknowledgement that it is indeed a gift worth recognizing. And we do it at home, we do it at work, we do it with colleagues, we do it with learners, we do it with impassioned strangers, we do it with those who transgress us without apology, and it's exhausting.
Amen, sister. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Well, maybe one more question, if that is the response. Do we have one more, hopefully quickly? Yes.
Yeah, where, in the space of forgiveness, reconciliation, where, from each of your perspectives, would someone find sort of the resources, the internal resources they need to forgive and to reconcile?
I can tell you where I go. But it's a really important question. My little story is when I wrote the book, Exclusion and Embrace, translated into Croatian. I'm introducing this book to Croatian audience who is very ambivalent about the book because it's demanding too much of them. A person stands in the back, waits until I finish, waits until everybody has asked question, comes to me and says, but where do I get it? And I said, where do you get what? Where do I get the will to embrace the other person? Here's a person who wants to forgive, who wants to embrace, but doesn't know where these resources might come because he feels too angry, too broken, too whatever else. And I'm stunned. I don't know what to tell him. And I simply tell him where I get it, where I seek it. And I seek it in the example of Christ, in the fundamental act which I think undergirds my entire existence as I experience it. And that is not just forgiveness, but also the gratuitous gift of life. And when I think in those terms, then I can open up to forgive. I can quiet the little green thing that sits here, whispers into my ear, this is crazy. You've done it once, you've done it twice, you've got it 10 times. It won't make no difference whatsoever. And one does it. Broken and unfinished way, with regret. I forgive during the day. At 2 o'clock at night, I wake up. What? And then narrate the whole story of what is that. And so forgiveness goes, I think. And it is a spiritual, if you want, struggle. It is a process of maturation of the self into the forgiveness that maybe comes.
I don't have anything to add.
Any further? All right. Well, thank you so much. Please give a hand to our speakers.